Hey guys, what's going on? It's Jay, and today I'm going to talk about why you need an 85mm lens. So an 85mm lens used on a full-frame camera like my Sony a7C II, for example, is ideal for making your subjects pop off the screen. This is why so many photographers use an 85mm for portraits, in particular, including myself. It's been my go-to lens for taking portraits of my kids as they grow and as they get older. As you can see here, I've been doing it since they were very, very small, and I continue to take pictures of them, every year or so with an 85mm as well as some other lenses. And I just love that portrait look that the 85mm lens produces. And because it's 85mm, you can get a little further away from your subject, so you lose a little bit of that perspective distortion that you might get from a 50mm portrait lens, for example. That's another great lens for portraits, but you do have to get a little bit closer for those tight headshots, which will give you just a little bit more of that perspective distortion. So basically what that means is how much of the ears you'll see. The further back you are and the more zoomed in you are, the less distortion there will be as far as perspective goes. Now, I've gotten some of my favorite portraits ever with my 85mm f1.8 lens, and here's a few of them just as an example of some of my childhood friends. Like, we're all grown up now, but I just love these shots, and you throw them into black and white. Looks especially cool. I also got some of my favorite pet portraits. This one here of my dog Chubbs. Unfortunately, he died very young. He was only like 1.5 years, 2 years, and he had some internal problems, and it was horrible, but I got some really great shots of Chubbs that I love. So for this video, I got 3 of the most affordable 85mm lenses out there. In my opinion, they are the best options for the money. But in addition to that, we also have the super high quality pro grade 85mm lenses that Canon, Sony, and Nikon make. So we're talking 85mm f1.2s, 85mm f1.4s, for example. Then you got the manual focus lens world as well. So as you can see here, I actually used the Canon 85mm f1.2 lens. It's an EF lens. Now, I used this years ago with my Canon 5D Mark II, and the depth of field is so narrow on this lens. It's literally like the eyelashes are the only thing that's sharp type thing. This was a much older camera, so it did tend to grab the eyelashes a lot of times, but you could see just how razor thin the depth of field is, and the subject just pops off the screen. So look at this one of my dog Sadie. I just love the way the subject pops with the 85mm, and it's great for product photography as well. As you could see, this camera here and another memory card, just showing off like what you can do with an 85mm. I also really like using it for like beverages and food if you can get far enough away. It's really great for like posing beer in a glass and stuff like that. You see a lot of those types of shots from breweries and stuff when they're sharing, their marketing materials on Instagram and so forth. A lot of them are using 85mm lenses, and it really makes that beer, pop off from the background. Again, it's just making the subject pop, so it doesn't really matter what the subject is. It just pops off the screen with an 85mm. As you can see on the green bridge here, the background separation is phenomenal. Now, this is a full frame lens. I'm using the Sony a7C II, just to be clear. And it's a very affordable lens as well. So you can see the background separation is incredible on this lens. I'm at f1.8 right now, and this is what you can expect. Now, when it comes to 85mm lenses, they vary in price, of course, but I like to try to stick to the more affordable lenses on this channel because I honestly can't afford the GM lenses and some of these f1.4s, f1.2s, some of these newer super high-end lenses are just crazy expensive. They're definitely awesome, don't get me wrong, but I can't afford them. And it's just, I can't justify that type of money, especially when something like this is so good. So again, this is f1.8. Now, you have basically the Sony 85mm f1.8, you have the 7Artisans 85mm f1.8, and I also have the Yongnuo, I think you say it, 85mm f1.8. So I'm going to compare those 3. Now, the Sony is clearly the most expensive at about $550. The 7Artisans is the cheapest at $300 as of the time of this review. And the Yongnuo is about $345 or something like that at the time of this review. Now, shockingly, the 7Artisans has like the most features, and it's the cheapest. It's got a manual aperture ring. So let's see how these lenses perform. What I need to test is distortion, focus speed. Now the Sony's going to have an advantage there with the dual linear focus motors. I also want to check fringing, flaring with the sun, the star field, focus breathing, corner sharpness. So the minimum focus distance or magnification that these lenses are capable of is pretty much the same. It's about 80 centimeters minimum focus distance. But what is different that will matter is the aperture diaphragm blades. Now again, the 7Artisans has the most. It's got 11 aperture blades in there. So it should give the most pleasing out of focus area when stopped down. You know, when wide open, it doesn't really matter because the aperture is just wide open. But when you stop it down, it starts to create like an octagoning effect sort of thing, depending on how many aperture blades there are, of course. Now, let me show you the focus transition and how it works on this lens here. See if the focus tracking, you know what I mean? Things like that. Should work really well. I have the focus transition speed set in the middle right now, so it's not at the fastest focus transition. So if I go out of frame, you'll see it'll take a second, and then it'll go to the background. We'll bring it back to the face, nice and smooth. Now, notice the focus breathing. You'll see it looks like a zoom on the edges. Watch that again. See how it looks like it's zoomed out a little bit, and now it's going to look like it's zooming in a little bit? That's the focus breathing. Now, it's just keep note of that. We're going to compare it with the three lenses, all right? So let me show you what this looks like when I stop it down. Now this has a manual aperture ring, so it's really easy to do. I can just do it right on the lens itself. I just want to show you what the background looks like at f4, and we will compare that with the other two lenses as well. All right, guys, so now I'm recording with the Yongnuo 85mm f1.8 lens. Now take note of the background separation here and what it looks like. Now this lens does have a much larger lens hood, which probably will help a little bit with sun flare, because right now I could see the light coming down. So we'll see how this compares to the smaller lens hood on the 7Artisans in this given lighting environment. Like obviously it only really matters depending on the angle of the sun and so forth, light sources. So keep that in mind. Let's check the focus. Note the focus breathing as well, guys. Don't forget that zooming effect. And also take note of the contrast. I have the camera set exactly the same way. I'm using daylight white balance, and everything else is pretty much at regular aperture priority mode. I'm not using S-Log or anything for this test, just so you know. This is going to be straight off the camera. Seems to work pretty darn good. Get a little closer, move back, see how the tracking works. All right, guys, there's f4. So let's compare the f4 here to the 7Artisans lens. So what we're looking for is how pleasing the background is. So like this might look busy, or it might look too contrasty or something like that. The background separation like has a look, and depending on the lens elements and whatnot, it's gonna look different. So that's very important to compare that when looking at an 85mm lens, because like I said, these lenses, you could just take a picture of anything pretty much with an 85mm lens and it looks awesome. It has such good 3D pop and 3D separation, which is one of the reasons why I love this lens. Obviously, it's pretty much the perfect portrait lens. I just did a puppy shoot with the 7Artisans 85mm. I'm going to show you some of those photos, and I was so happy with the results. So just keep that in mind, all right? All right, guys, so what you're looking at now is the Sony 85mm f1.8 lens. Now, this is by far the most expensive lens in this test. It goes for about $550 or so retail. It's on sale sometimes for like $100 off, though. Watch out for the sales. But what's fascinating about this lens is it's the lightest lens at about 13 ounces or so. But it's also the largest lens. It's got a 67mm filter thread, but it's a mostly plastic build, so it's very lightweight. As far as the contrast and stuff, we're going to have to compare those. It should be pretty close to the other two lenses, I would imagine, but we'll see. Notice the background separation here. Now, this lens has the dual linear autofocus motors, so it should be significantly better at tracking high-speed moving subjects. So as far as acquiring my face, you know, it's going to work pretty well, as you can see here. There we go. Oh, there's somebody coming. How you doing? All right, guys, so I'm going to stop the lens down to f4. Now, this has a 9-blade aperture compared to the 7Artisans, which has an 11. And the Yongnuo I just tested has a 7-blade. So let's see what 9-blade rounded looks like. All right, guys, so this is what a 9-blade rounded aperture looks like. I should be at approximately the same distance, so we can compare all three lenses. From this distance, looking at the screen, I can't tell the difference, just to let you guys know. Until I see this on the computer, it's impossible to tell. It looks like all three lenses are very, very similar. All right, guys, so one distinct advantage that the Sony lens has, besides the dual linear focus motors we already talked about for, you know, tracking high-speed moving subjects and stuff, definitely a huge advantage. But the Sony lens also supports focus breathing on cameras that support that. Now, focus breathing will crop in, so it does crop. And what that allows it to do is when it focuses, there should be no breathing. All right, so watch when it switches to my face here, how it doesn't zoom. So there should be like no zooming in the corners up here. I'll test this again on a static subject. But anyways, that's focus breathing. Now again, it comes at the cost of cropping in, so it's like a digital crop. So let me turn it off and you'll see like the wider view again, just for reference. All right guys, so now I have the focus breathing off and I'm at pretty much the same distance, but you can see that my hat was like cropped off before a second ago. But right about here, you can see it's just a slightly wider view when focus breathing is off. And again, watch that focus zoom effect. See how it's zooming? That's what goes away with focus breathing. So that is a pretty important feature. All right, so I'm just shooting into the sun here at f16, just so you can see what the flaring looks like. So pretty much directly into the sun. See what happens if I turn this a little bit. Seems to handle it pretty well. Alright, here's the Yongnuo at f16. Just get it to the side of the frame a little bit there. See the sun flare. So there's f16, just for reference. Now if I turn it a little bit, see how that flaring is affected. Now I went over the sharpness in the lab here, and honestly I was quite surprised that the Sony is significantly sharper in the corners than the other two lenses, although in the real world, as you'll see in a minute, they're very close overall in the center area. Nice and smooth. And silent. I can hear this lens. This one makes the most noise for sure in this test. The Yongnuo was silent and the Sony was silent, but the 7Artisans, I can definitely hear it. Alright, so this is the Sony lens at f1.8, just doing the focus transition test here. And this lens seems to perform the best. The dual linear autofocus motors, there's no delay. So this is with focus breathing off. Let me just turn focus breathing on real quick to show you that, because this lens has that, which is an advantage. Alright, so now we got focus breathing comp on, and there should be no zooming now, as you can see. So if that matters to you, this really is a pretty big deal. Alright guys, so this is a little bit harder of a test with the focus breathing and focus transition. So right now I'm focused on that lock on the top there. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on the background so you can watch the focus transition and, you know, the focus breathing and so forth. And now I'm going to try to bring it back to the lock, but it's not able to do it. Switch to manual. I'm going to bring it back. So it's got the switch on the lens. We can just easily switch it back to manual and then get it back. So now again it's focused on the lock, and let me just show you that focus breathing one more time. There we have it. And I'll show you that in reverse as well so you could see the zooming a little more clearly. But very smooth overall, I would say. So at this minimum focus distance is a very difficult test, so let's try the other lenses. Alright guys, so now we have the 7Artisans lens mounted and I have it focused on the lock. So I'm just going to focus on the background now. You can see that. Let's see if we can get it to go back to the lock. Negative. Alright, so switch to manual focus. This has a really long focus throw, which is nice. Makes it easy to get it fine-tuned. put it back to autofocus. Let's do that one more time. There we go. Alrighty, so now I got the Sony lens mounted. Let's go to the background here. Very good. Let's see if we can go back to the lock. Look at that. So there is an advantage, guys, to the Sony lens. Like, they are better when it comes to focusing. In the real world, for the most part, they all work great. But when it comes to stuff like this, at the minimum focus distance, that's where you can see the difference. Alrighty, so now I have the focus breathing comp on. You should see it's cropped in a little bit compared to how it was before. And we'll go to the background, try to go back to the lock. And there we have it. So now there should be very little of that zooming on the edges that we were seeing when the focus breathing was not enabled. So 2 huge advantages to the Sony. Again, if this stuff matters to you, faster and a little bit more accurate dual linear focus motors. It works better at the minimum focus distance, you can clearly see. In addition to that, you do get the focus breathing compensation as well. All right, guys, I just want to show you the bokeh testing in the lab really quick so you can see the difference between, in particular, the aperture blades and how they work. So here at f1.8, you can see pretty much all 3 lenses look the same. So here's the 85mm Yongnuo first. Here's the 7Artisans 85mm. So you can see it looks very similar, could barely tell the difference. There is slightly different, optics, so you can see like it's a slightly different, shape, like a little bit zoomed differently. You can see the distortion. That's why it's looking different. The Yongnuo has the most distortion, as you can see in these 2 shots. And then here is the Sony lens, which looks like a little bit more zoomed out. But again, they all render very, very well. They all look nearly identical in this particular test. So now when we stop it down to f4, this is where you're really going to start to notice the difference in the bokeh ball rendering, as you can see here. So the 7 blades gets you this. And then if you look at the 7Artisans lens, which has 11 blades, it yields you this. So you can see it looks a lot more round. Now, keep in mind, guys, these bokeh balls are on very tiny lights. They're like those Christmas tree lights. So I'm kind of exploiting this. On larger light sources, you don't even notice this near as much. Just so you know, you can see here on the background on the larger light, you see how you can't see that octagoning? Just keep that in mind, all right? I just wanted to make you aware of that. So this is exaggerating it, but that's why I have it in my lab scene so you can really see this stuff. Now here's the Sony lens at f4, which is the 9 blade. So you can see it looks very similar to the 7Artisans. So here's the 7Artisans, and here's the Sony. You can see that very, very similar. So the 9 versus 11 really doesn't yield that much of a difference in this test. So now for the distortion. So here we're looking at the Yongnuo 85mm, and you can see when I bring up the grid, there's quite a bit of distortion. You can see how it kind of looks pinched there a little bit. It's got that curvature here on the mortar line on the top and the bottom, so you can see, just what it looks like. So note when I stop it down to f4, how the vignetting goes away. That's the darkening of the corners. And all 3 lenses look very similar in that regard, by the way, as far as the vignetting goes. Now here is the 7Artisans. So you can see the 7Artisans has significantly less distortion when I bring these lines up, but it still has some. You can see it on the bottom of the windowsill in particular and the top of the window frame. And then again, vignetting, you can see it there. That's what f1.8 looks like. That's f4. Now here is the Sony lens, and you can see the Sony lens has the least distortion out of all 3, but it also suffers from some vignetting. As you can see here at f4, it opens up. So I would say the Sony probably has the least vignetting. 7Artisans is very close. The Yongnuo seems to have the most, which makes sense because it's the smallest physical lens, so it's going to be a little bit harder to get that light through there. All right, guys, so I have the Sony lens on the left here, and I have the 7Artisans on the right. Now, both were at f1.8, and now if we zoom in here, you can see they look literally identical. I can't even tell the difference, but if we zoom in, you can see a little bit of a difference here. Now, mostly it's just the sharpness. The sharpness on the Sony lens is a little bit better than the 7Artisans. You can just see it's just a little bit more tack sharp. But as far as the bokeh rendering goes, it looks identical. Like, I can't really tell a difference at all in this test. So let's see how it compares to the Yongnuo. All right, so again, now we have the Yongnuo on the right and we have the Sony on the left. Now if we zoom in, you could see again that the Sony just looks a little bit sharper on the lock itself, which is what I focused on, but very close overall in the real world. And you can see the background rendering looks nearly identical. I can't really tell the difference. So really, really good in the real world, I would say, overall. Here are the three lenses. We have the Sony 85mm f1.8 lens, then we have the Yongnuo 85mm f1.8 lens, and then we have the 7Artisans 85mm f1.8 lens. So the 7Artisans lens goes for about $300, and it's a very nice build quality. It has a pedal style lens hood here. It's got the pinch style lens cap, take that off. We have a 62mm filter thread on the front of the 7Artisans lens. Now, the focus ring is a little bit tight on the 7Artisans lens compared to the other two lenses. It feels very smooth, but it's pretty tight. And it also has a very large focus throw. So when using manual focus, you have to turn this quite a bit, which is an advantage when you're trying to get your focus as accurate as possible. It's easier with a longer focus throw. Some lenses, you only have to turn the focus ring like, you know, at X amount of degrees, and that will be the whole throw. This one has quite a bit, so you gotta like keep turning it. It also has a custom button here you can program, and it has an autofocus manual focus switch. In addition to that, the 7Artisans has a manual clickless aperture here. Looking at the back of the 7Artisans, we have a nice all-metal lens bayonet. There is no rubber gasket here, but it does have the USB-C port here for firmware updates. Now the 7Artisans also has an 11-blade aperture diaphragm in there, which will give you really pleasing out-of-focus areas even when stopped down. This is the heaviest lens out of the three, weighing in at 15.4 ounces or 438 grams approximately. So it's a metal build, but it does come at the cost of a little bit of weight. By the way, guys, 85mm on a crop factor camera is going to work out to about 127.5mm. One thing I don't like about the 7Artisans is how it's like a little bit loose, the lens cap here. So it makes a little bit of noise. So it just is what it is, $300. Okay, so now we got the Yongnuo 85mm. So the Yongnuo comes in at a little bit more money than the 7Artisans at $345, and it actually has a 58mm filter thread on the front, so it is physically the smallest lens as far as form factor goes. It's got a very nice large lens hood though, I really like that, and of course the pinch style lens cap as well. Now the focus ring on this lens feels very good. It's very easy to turn. It's very smooth as well. We also have a USB-C port right here for updates. Now this lens also does feature the custom button here, and it has an autofocus manual focus switch that feels pretty good. Now looking at the back here, we have a nice metal lens bayonet, and we also have a rubber gasket. So this lens features that rubber gasket, which is quite nice. And this lens is pretty beefy as well. It weighs in at 13.6 ounces or 385 grams. Now the lens hood, like I said, is very nice and it fits nice and tight, so there's none of that chattering like you saw a second ago on the 7Artisans. Now lastly, we have the Sony 85mm f1.8 lens, and this is what she looks like. Now this is the largest lens physically. It's the biggest one. It actually has a 67mm filter thread on the front of it. It's got a nice lens hood as well. Throw that on there. And it locks on tight, so there's none of that chattering. The focus ring feels great on this lens. It's very similar to the Yongnuo feeling. It just has a little bit better dampening. The Yongnuo is a little bit easier to turn with a little less dampening. It's got an autofocus manual focus switch, and it has a custom button here as well. Looking at the back, we have a nice metal lens bayonet, but there is no rubber gasket on this lens. So the Sony lens is actually the lightest at 13.09 ounces or 371 grams, and that's pretty much because it's made out of plastic. So it's a more plastic build, whereas the other two lenses have a lot more metal. Now this is by far the most expensive lens in this test, but it does offer dual linear focus motors, which is a pretty huge advantage when tracking moving subjects. Or trying to photograph moving subjects, for example. In addition, the Sony lens also offers focus breathing support. And lastly, the Sony lens is actually sharper based on my testing in the lab and the real world. So you do get something for the extra money when it comes to the Sony. Now, I used all three of these lenses on my Sony a7C II for testing in this video. Alright guys, so at the end of the day, all three of these lenses performed great in the real world, I would say, especially for photography. Now, when it comes to video, the Sony definitely does have the biggest advantages over the other two lenses because it has focus breathing support and it has the dual linear autofocus motors, which work better. In addition, the Sony was able to focus better at the minimum focus distance, which is a tough test in all fairness. You saw on the bridge there. And when it comes to the 7Artisans lens, it's the heaviest lens in this test, but it's also the cheapest. The image quality is outstanding on all three lenses, but the Sony does have an edge when it comes to tack sharpness, especially in the corners, as you saw from the lab testing. Now, when stopping down, the 7Artisans has an advantage with that 11 blade aperture, but the 9 blade rounded aperture in the Sony looks very similar when zoomed in. The Yongnuo, however, definitely octagons that, you know, that little bit. When you stop down to like f4, you could really see that in the lab testing. In the real world, it was hard to tell though on the bridge. They all looked great at f4. Now, the 7Artisans autofocus motor makes noise, so you can hear it when recording video. So that is a negative. You could also hear it when taking photos, when it's like hunting and stuff. The Yongnuo, however, silent autofocus motor, couldn't hear it. And the Sony, I could not hear the focus motor on that lens either. Now, when it comes to the distortion, the Yongnuo suffered the most from the distortion, followed by the 7Artisans was less distortion, and then the Sony had the best distortion control, which does make sense considering it's the largest lens. Now, I did not have the lens profile or any of that stuff enabled on the camera or in Lightroom, just to let you know. As far as vignetting goes, they all kind of suffered from vignetting at f1.8. That's the darkening of the corners, but around f4 or so, you know, that all clears up. So that was pretty equal across the three lenses. All right, guys, I really hope you got something out of this video. And below, I will have all these lenses linked, and they are affiliate links. So I really greatly appreciate you guys using those links if you're doing some shopping and so forth, especially if you appreciated this video. A thumbs up would be great, and be super cool if you hit that subscribe button as well. I would also love to hear your comments below. What lens do you think looked the best? Can you even tell the difference between the three lenses? And if you already have one of these lenses, which one do you own? I would love to know. All right, guys, I will catch up with you next time. Take care.